Chapter 1. The Twilight of Lord Xelthar. The halls of Karen-Vael were silent but for the whispering wind that slithered through the fortress like a serpent. The obsidian towers of the ancestral keep loomed over the jagged cliffs of Naggaroth, their spires reaching for a sky as black as the souls of those who dwelled within. Fires burned low in the great hall, their dying embers casting flickering shadows over the gathered nobles. There was no warmth here. Only the scent of cold steel, poisoned wine, and ambition, barely restrained beneath the veneer of civility. Seated upon his high throne of barbed iron was Lord Xelthar of House Xelthar, the patriarch of a dynasty built upon treachery, cruelty, and cunning. His form was draped in a heavy cloak of black dragon hide, his gaunt features made ever more severe by the dim torchlight. He was old, ancient even, but there was no weakness in his gaze. His eyes, like shards of ice, swept across the chamber, lingering upon each of his 6 children. They had come at his summons, drawn like carrion birds to the promise of spoils. At the center of the hall stood Malzareth, the eldest and strongest, his hand resting lightly on the pommel of his blade, Naggaroth, a weapon soaked in the blood of countless foes. His armor, fashioned from the midnight scales of a slain hydra, shimmered darkly under the flickering torches. He stood with the arrogance of a conqueror, his expression unreadable as he met his father's gaze. To his right stood Vaedrith, second-born and ever smirking, his lean frame wrapped in the dark silks of a noble duelist. His fingers drummed lazily against the hilt of his twin daggers, each honed to a razor's edge. His emerald eyes gleamed with mischief and murder. Beside him, Avarice, the third-born, exuded an unsettling grace. Her presence was an enigma, her dark robes whispering against the cold stone as she adjusted the runed rings on her slender fingers. The scent of ritualistic incense clung to her, mingling with the faint trace of freshly spilled blood upon her wrist. She did not need steel, her magic was far deadlier. Further down stood Xelthara, the youngest daughter, her lips curled in an expression of thinly veiled contempt. The shadows seemed to coil around her, as though she existed on the very edge of reality itself. And finally, Solaris and Drazen, the twin vipers, stood together, inseparable, indistinguishable, and utterly remorseless. Their cruelty was a thing of legend, and even among their kin they were feared. Lord Xelthar inhaled deeply, exhaling slowly as he let the tension thicken. "You are my blood," he began, his voice a rasping blade cutting through the silence. "You are the heirs to House Xelthar, the legacy of our kind, and yet I see in you nothing but vultures circling a corpse not yet cold." His words lingered in the air like a curse. Malzareth did not flinch, but Vaedrith smirked. Avarice's lips curled ever so slightly, and the twins exchanged a glance that promised amusement yet to come. Xelthar continued, "My time wanes, the Witch King's court has grown perilous, and my usefulness to him has reached its twilight. Malekith's will is absolute, and those of us who grow old without purpose are soon discarded. I do not intend to be discarded." His grip on the armrests of his throne tightened. "So, I have made my decision." The room was utterly still. The very air seemed to hold its breath. "My firstborn, Malzareth, will inherit Karen-Vael and the might of my armies. It is he who will carry our house forward into the next age." Malzareth did not react. He simply bowed his head in acknowledgement, though his sharp gaze never left his father's. Vaedrith's smirk twitched, his hand tightening briefly on his dagger before he relaxed once more. Avarice merely studied her eldest brother, her fingers tightening around the runed rings at her knuckles. The twins exchanged knowing looks, while Xelthara's eyes darkened with something far more dangerous than mere discontent. Xelthar was not blind to their displeasure. He smiled coldly. "And yet," he continued, "it would be unwise to place all my faith in one. Each of you shall have your share." There was a flicker of renewed interest among the gathered heirs. To Vaedrith I leave my fleet. The Black-Fang corsairs shall answer to you. To Devoured, I grant my archives and my library of forbidden knowledge. To Xelthar I gift the obsidian vaults and their secrets. Do with them as you will. To the twins, Zelara and Drazin, I bestow my network of spies and informants. Use them wisely, or not at all. It was a gift, but it was also a challenge. They were dark elves. There was no peace among them, only the pretense of loyalty, the dance of daggers in the dark. Xelthar had given them tools, and now he would watch to see who wielded them best. His gaze swept across them once more. Do not mistake this for generosity. This is an opportunity. If you are strong enough, you will take more than what I have given. A silence followed, a silence filled with the unspoken promise of bloodshed. Each heir bowed in turn, offering murmured words of fealty. But their minds were already racing with schemes, each plotting the death of the others. As the audience concluded and the great hall emptied, Malzareth lingered, his grip tightening around his sword. You know they will move against me, he said simply. Xelthar leaned forward, the ghost of a smile upon his lips. Of course, that is how it has always been. Malzareth turned without another word, disappearing into the cold corridors of Karond-Vael. Above the fortress, the blackened sky churned, and a distant storm rumbled, a fitting omen for the bloodshed to come. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Dark. The great halls of Karen-Vael had fallen into uneasy silence. The torches lining the black stone corridors flickered weakly, their light feeble against the pressing darkness that clung to the fortress like a restless spectre. The scent of cold iron and distant blood lingered in the air, an unspoken promise of the treachery yet to come. Far beneath the main keep, beyond the grand chambers where Malzareth brooded upon his inheritance, the true plotting had begun. The spider's web. Vaedrith moved through the underground corridors with the soundless grace of a serpent. The deeper halls of Karond-Vael were seldom used, home to dust, forgotten relics, and echoes of whispered betrayals long past. He knew the way well. He had come here often as a child, drawn by the forbidden presence that awaited him in the crypt below. At last he reached the chamber, a vast, arched room of polished obsidian and blood-red runes, where a single figure sat upon a throne of jagged onyx. Lady Cirith. His mother. She was an echo of a fading legend. But to Vaedrith, she was something far more dangerous, a mother who had never been meant to bear children. Cirith had once been among the Witch King's most feared courtiers, a priestess of Cain, whose beauty and cruelty were whispered of in hushed tones, even among the hag queens. But the years had not been kind. Betrayal had cost her her position, and time had stripped her of the favor she once wielded. Now she was a shadow of her former self, confined to the depths of Karond-Vael, her influence diminished, yet never extinguished. She looked up as Vaedrith approached, her pale lips curling into a slow, knowing smile. "My son," she purred, her voice like the stroke of a dagger along silk. "You've come." Vaedrith knelt smoothly, a gesture of respect, though not submission. He would never submit to anyone, not even her. "He has given it all to Malzareth," he said, his voice void of emotion. Cirith tilted her head, her fingers idly tracing the skull of a long-dead rival that rested upon the arm of her throne. "Did you expect anything different?" Vaedrith's eyes flashed with something sharp, something dangerous. "He gave me the fleet, but it's a mockery. I am a shark locked in a cage while my brother dines on the spoils of war." Cirith let out a soft, dark chuckle. "Then perhaps it is time to break the cage, my love." Vaedrith remained silent. He did not need to ask what she meant. Cirith leaned forward, her nails grazing his cheek with something akin to affection, though the sensation was closer to a blade pressing against his skin. You were always my favorite, my beautiful boy." Her voice was a whisper of poison. "You know what must be done." Vaydrith's lips curved into a slow, wicked smirk. "Yes," he murmured. "I do." The blackened blades. Night had fallen over Karen-Vael. The fortress slumbered beneath a sky of roiling storm clouds, the air thick with the promise of violence. In the corridors leading to Malzeri's private chambers, shadows moved where there should have been none. The blackened blades were among the most feared assassins in Naggaroth, silent, relentless, and bound by no oaths but those of coin and blood. They answered to no master but the one who paid them. Tonight, Vaydrith had paid them well. The lead assassin, a wraith in lacquered black armor, moved with deadly precision. His daggers, coated in widow's kiss, a toxin that burned through veins like molten glass, were drawn. The others followed, fanning out like wraiths, each step swallowed by the hush of enchanted leather and silk-wrapped steel. Ahead, Malzereth's chamber doors loomed. A simple lock barred the way, laughable. With a flick of the assassin's wrist, the mechanism clicked open without so much as a whisper. They slipped inside. The chamber was vast, draped in banners of past victories, an arsenal of cruel weapons displayed upon the walls. Malzereth's form lay still upon the grand bed, his breathing slow, deep. The lead assassin raised his dagger and struck. Steel met steel. A blur of motion erupted as Malzereth's blade met the assassin's knife in a violent clash, sparks erupting into the darkness. The bed was empty, an illusion. Malzereth had been waiting. The trap had been set for the hunters. The assassins reacted instantly, lunging at their prey, but Malzereth moved like a beast unleashed. His blade, Naggaroth, flashed in the dim light, carving through the first attacker's throat before the man could even scream. The others struck from all sides, but Malzereth was no mere swordsman. He was a warlord, a master of the killing fields. A dagger slashed toward his side. He twisted, catching the assassin's wrist in an iron grip before snapping it like a dry twig. The scream was cut short by the thrust of his blade into the assassin's ribcage. Another came from behind. Malzereth spun low, slamming his elbow into the attacker's gut, then driving his sword upward through the assassin's chin and out the top of his skull. The last of the blackened blades turned to flee. He never made it to the door. Malzereth flung a dagger from his belt, embedding it deep into the back of the fleeing assassin's skull. The body hit the floor, twitching once, then went still. The chamber fell into silence. Malzereth exhaled slowly, blood dripping from his blade onto the cold stone floor. His heart thundered, but his mind was already working, piecing together the truth. The assassins were skilled, too skilled to have been mere mercenaries. Someone had sent them. Someone with means, someone with ambition, someone with reason to see him dead. Malzereth turned toward the darkened corridors beyond his chamber, his grip tightening on his blade. His siblings had moved against him. That was their mistake, because now it was his turn. Chapter 3. The First Cut. The grand hall of Karond-Vael had not seen such an opulent gathering in decades. A banquet had been called, not in celebration, but as a form of finality. The division of Lord Xelthar's legacy had been declared, and now the noble house gathered for what was meant to be a display of unity, a hollow illusion at best. The table stretched the length of the vast chamber, black marble veined with crimson, polished so smooth it gleamed like a still pool of blood. Silver candelabras burned low, their flickering light casting restless shadows against the walls. Ancient suits of armor, adorned with the skulls of past traitors, lined the hall like silent sentinels. Lord Xelthar, ever the brooding patriarch, sat at the head of the table, his expression unreadable, as if he were merely an observer in the war his children were waging beneath the surface. Malzereth sat to his right, his face a mask of cold detachment, though his fingers never strayed far from the dagger at his belt. The attempt on his life the night before had not shaken him, but it had awakened something else within him, the hunger to strike back. To Xelthar's left, Vaedrith lounged in his seat with the ease of a man who had nothing to fear, though his ever-present smirk was sharper than usual. Across from him sat Avris, silent, watching, her gaze flitting between her brothers like a cat studying caged mice. Further down, Xelthara sipped her wine without expression, her mind seemingly far away, though Malzareth knew better. The twins, Selaris and Drazin, whispered between themselves in hushed tones, their movements eerily synchronized. And then there was Dareth, the youngest of them all, a mere afterthought. He had never been a contender in the silent war of succession, too weak, too foolish, too naive. The perfect target, the poisoned chalice. The wine was poured. Rich, dark, and fragrant, it swirled in the goblets of each heir as servants moved with trained efficiency. The first sip had barely touched lips before Dareth convulsed, his goblet falling from his grip with a loud clang against the stone floor. His body seized, his eyes bulging as his throat constricted, choking on nothing but air. His veins darkened, turning black beneath his pale skin as froth gathered at the corners of his mouth. The hall erupted into motion. Malzareth rose from his seat, blade in hand. Vaedrith merely watched, his smirk vanishing, replaced by something far more calculating. Avrith stood as well, her gaze locked on Dareth with something almost like curiosity. The twins, for once, said nothing. Dareth clawed at his throat, a final gasp escaping his lips before his body slumped against the table, wine pooling beneath him like a mockery of the blood yet to be spilled. The banquet fell into silence. Then laughter, low, quiet, and laced with venom. Vaedrith swirled his wine in his goblet, leaning back in his chair as if nothing had happened. A shame, he mused. It was his first taste of vintage from the family's stores. I'd have thought he'd enjoy it more. Malzair's eyes snapped toward his brother. You did this. The words were not a question. Vaedrith raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. Me? Do you truly believe I would waste my time poisoning a child? Come now, Malzareth, you wound me. He gestured lazily toward their other siblings. Any of us could have done it, even our darling Avris. Avris tilted her head, the barest hint of a smile ghosting her lips. Why would I waste poison on Dareth? Malzareth ignored her, rounding the table toward Vaedrith, his blade half drawn. Enough. Xelthar's voice cut through the air, stopping him in his tracks. The old patriarch rose from his throne at the head of the table, stepping forward with deliberate slowness. His aged hand trailed along the rim of his goblet, and for a moment he studied the deep crimson liquid within, as though expecting it to whisper secrets to him. Then, without hesitation, he drank. Every eye in the hall was locked onto him. The old noble swallowed the wine without hesitation, without fear. No reaction. Xeldar exhaled through his nose and set the goblet down. It seems I was not meant to die tonight. His gaze swept over his remaining children. But one of you saw fit to kill your weakest kin before they even had the chance to prove themselves. His fingers tapped against the table. A slow, methodical sound. Perhaps I should thank you. One less vulture to pick at my bones when I am gone. Dareth's corpse lay sprawled across the table. Unmourned. Forgotten. The unseen hand. The banquet had not ended in merriment. It had ended in whispers, glances, and suspicions left to fester. Malzareth cornered Vaedrith in the corridors beyond the great hall, his blade drawn, his patience spent. You think this is a game? Malzareth growled, shoving his younger brother hard against the cold stone wall. If you think I'll let this insult pass? Vaedrith's smirk returned, his teeth glinting in the dim torchlight. Oh, Malzareth, you wound me. I told you already I had nothing to do with it. But I do admire whoever did. A well-paid move, don't you think? Malzareth's grip tightened. "I should kill you where you stand." "Then do it," Vaedrith whispered. "Or are you afraid?" For a moment Malzareth considered it. Then, from the shadows, a soft chuckle. "Brothers?" Avarice murmured as she stepped forward, her presence like silk sliding through a blade's edge. "Such passion! It is delightful." Malzareth released Vaedrith, eyes narrowing. "This was your doing, wasn't it?" Avarice tilted her head, amusement dancing in her gaze. Now, if I were responsible, wouldn't that mean I had just won a round against both of you?" She stepped closer, brushing past them as though they were beneath her notice. "Thought. Or perhaps," she whispered, "I merely want you to think that." With that, she was gone. Vaedrith chuckled, adjusting his tunic. "I do so love our dear sister's sense of humor." Malzareth didn't respond. He was too busy replaying every word, every movement. Dareth had been killed, but his death was not the true attack. The real strike had been made in the silence that followed. Now no one trusted anyone, and that was the true first cut. Chapter 4. The Death of a Tyrant. The storm that had been brewing over Karond-Vael finally broke. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the jagged spires of the fortress in ghostly white. The rain that followed was relentless, a howling wind driving sheets of water against the black stone walls. But within the great hall, the storm outside was nothing compared to the chaos that had erupted within. Lord Xelthar was dead. His body lay sprawled upon his throne of iron and bone, his throat neatly slit from ear to ear. The blood had pooled beneath him, seeping into the cracks of the ancient stone floor like ink spilling from a shattered vial. His lifeless eyes, once sharp as honed steel, were empty, staring into nothing. The patriarch of House Xelthar, a man who had lived through centuries of treachery and war, had finally fallen to a single blade in the dark. And none of his children knew who had done it. The accusations begin. The moment the body was found, the halls of Karond-Vael erupted into madness. Guards turned on one another. Soldiers swore fealty to different heirs, whispering oaths in the shadows before steel was drawn and blood was spilled. Some of the house retainers tried to flee the keep, but the fortress had already sealed itself in paranoia and war. In the heart of the great hall, the 6 remaining heirs stood before their father's corpse, the air between them thick with suspicion and barely contained rage. Malzareth was the first to speak. His voice, usually cold and measured, was now iron and fire. "Which of you did this?" He did not ask if it was one of them. No, he knew one of them had done it. There was no other possibility. Vaedrith gave a slow, mocking smile. "Why so quick to accuse, brother? Are you rattled?" Malzareth's grip tightened around his sword. "I have no patience for your games, Vaedrith." "Then allow me to indulge you," Vaedrith mused, tapping his fingers against his belt. "I did not kill him. If I had, I would have ensured he suffered." Avery let out a soft chuckle, stepping forward, her gaze flickering over the body with something that looked more like amusement than horror. "If we are being honest," she murmured, "our dear father was long overdue for the knife. The only question is, who wielded it?" Silaries and Drazen exchanged a glance. The twin vipers had no expressions, their dark eyes unreadable pools. "If we had killed him," Drazen said, "you would all be dead by now as well." Xelthara remained silent. She alone did not look at the body. Her arms were crossed, her fingers tapping idly against the sleeve of her dark robes. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "It does not matter who did it, only who takes his place." Her words snapped the tension in the air like a bowstring loosed, because she was right. The rebellion erupts. As if the realization had been a signal, the halls of Karond-Vael exploded into war. The news of Xelthar's death had spread like wildfire, and every faction within the fortress had already chosen sides. Guards clashed with guards. Assassins emerged from hidden alcoves, striking down rival officers. Spells lashed through the corridors, warping reality as sorcery tore flesh from bone. The keep, once a monument of strength, was now a battlefield. And in the center of it all, Malzareth moved. Where others hesitated, where others schemed, he acted. "Lay and she," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the carnage. His most loyal retainers rallied, their swords flashing as they cut down anyone who dared stand against them. Secure the gates. Kill the rebels. Anyone who does not kneel dies. One by one, the factions broke. Some fled, some swore loyalty, and some were cut down where they stood. Vaedrith vanished into the shadows, slipping away with his assassins rather than fight in open battle. The twins retreated to their own stronghold within the keep, unwilling to gamble their lives on a battle they did not control. Xelthara was nowhere to be found. Heirs, however, did not run. She watched as Malzareth's forces crushed all resistance, as his soldiers dragged kneeling survivors before him, forcing them to swear fealty or die. Then she smiled. The throne is claimed. The throne of Karond-Vael was still slick with blood when Malzareth took his seat. The fortress was his now. Xelthar had ruled with cunning and fear, but Malzareth? He would rule with iron and fire. His hand rested upon the hilt of Naggaroth, his sword still warm from the blood of those who had resisted him. His warriors stood in silent obedience, the air thick with the scent of steel and death. Vaedrith, Averis, Xelthara, the twins, they were still alive, but that did not matter, because this was not over. No, this was just the beginning. Chapter 5. The Crimson Pact. The fires of Karond-Vael still burned. The battle for control had ended, but the aftermath was far from over. The fortress walls dripped with fresh blood, the bodies of those who had refused to bend left to rot in the dungeons below. The scent of death clung to the halls, mingling with the acrid smoke curling from shattered braziers. Malzareth had taken the throne, but the keep was not yet his. The others still lived, and in the cold, hollow hours of the night, a pact was forged, not of peace, but of patience. A gathering in the dark. They met in the lower chambers, where the torches burned with blue witchlight, casting shifting shadows along the curved walls. The air was damp, thick with the scent of old parchment, alchemical residue, and the cold iron tang of the ritual circle etched into the floor. Here, beneath the weight of their father's legacy, the surviving heirs gathered, not as allies, but as pragmatists. Averis was the first to speak, her voice as smooth as silk drawn over a dagger. We all know how this ends if we do not control it. She stepped forward, her black robes whispering over the stone, her silver rings glinting in the dim light. Malzareth holds the fortress, but none of us will allow him to keep it for long. If we break too soon, we fall alone. If we strike too late, we become the hunted. Vaedrith lounged against a broken statue of some long-dead ancestor, his ever-present smirk barely concealing the hunger in his eyes. "How poetic, dear sister," he mused, rolling a silver dagger between his fingers. "And what do you suggest, that we sip wine and play at civility while we all sharpen our knives in secret?" Averis smiled. "Exactly." Malzareth stood apart from them, arms folded, his gaze cold and calculating. He did not trust this. He was the strongest. He had won the first battle. But he was not a fool. Karond-Vael still bled. His enemies still breathed. So he let them talk, and when the whispers of an unspoken truce took form, he did not deny them. But in the depths of his mind, he was already planning his next move. The web of shadows. The war had not ended. It had merely gone invisible. Each heir scattered, returning to their personal domains within Naggaroth, feigning acceptance of the fragile peace, while their true work began. Malzareth, the warlord's council. Malzarat's rule was forged in steel and fire. He did not waste time pretending at diplomacy. He gathered warlords, beastmasters, and corsair captains, those who respected only strength. In the deep pits of Karond-Vael, he bought the loyalty of war beasts bred for slaughter, monstrous creatures that would soon devour his enemies. In the black markets of Karond, he whispered into the ears of corsair admirals, offering plunder and power in exchange for allegiance. When he was ready, he would not need daggers in the dark. He would drown his rivals in blood. Vaedrith, the silent blades. Vaedrith did what he did best, disappeared. From the depths of Arnheim, he gathered the Shade clans, whispering promises of silver and power into the ears of the killers who thrived in the cold wastes beyond Naggaroth. He paid well. Soon, the night itself would belong to him. Avarice, the witch's bargain. Avery's did not waste her time with blades or armies. Instead, she went to the Hag Queens of Grond, stepping into temples where blood never ceased to flow, where prayers to Cain were answered only in murder. She offered sacrifices, her hands stained red with devotion. When she left, she did so with the blessing of the temple and the silent smiles of the witch-elves who now followed in her wake. Xelthar, the forbidden pact. Xelthar moved unseen. In the depths of Harganeth, she walked the halls of the cult of Slaanesh, brushing against the lips of daemons, her whispered promises melting into the fabric of things not meant to be heard. The sorcery she sought was forbidden, but she had never cared for laws. When she returned to her chambers, she was no longer entirely alone. The pact is broken before it begins. The heirs had agreed to a truce. But in the dark corners of Naggaroth, their alliances took shape, their armies grew, and their betrayals were already set in motion. The Crimson Pact was never meant to last. It was not a peace. It was a waiting game, and soon the knives would be drawn once more. 3/3 Chapter 6. The Council of Vipers. The Crimson Pact was a lie. A fragile agreement, doomed from the moment it was spoken. The heirs had nodded, smiled, and whispered false words of patience, but in their hearts they had already drawn their blades. Now, as the cold winds howled across Naggaroth, they each moved in secret, calling upon their chosen allies. The war had not ended. It had only just begun. Malzareth, the warlord's bastion. The throne of Karond-Vael was his, but rule was never secure in Naggaroth. Malzareth had crushed the initial resistance, executed dissenters, and raised his banners over the fortress. But holding power was a different battle entirely. He stood atop the fortress walls, gazing down at the sprawling encampments of warriors, mercenaries, and soldiers loyal to him. His forces had swollen in the days since the truce. Many had sworn fealty, knowing his strength was unmatched. Others had needed persuasion, and Malzareth had been all too happy to provide it in blood. His inner circle gathered in the great hall below. Darek the Beastmaster, fresh from Karond-Vael, whispering of war hydras and manticores ready to be unleashed. Corsair Captain Edrak the Red, promising ships and cutthroats, as long as the pay was high enough. The dread knight Veliskar, his armor black as midnight, his lance drenched in the blood of 100 duels. "We strike first," Malzara declared, pacing before them. "We do not wait for my dear siblings to sharpen their knives in the dark. We burn their nests before their vipers are ready to strike." His warlords exchanged glances. Even among Drachau, Malzareth's ruthlessness was legendary. Dara grinned. And who dies first? Malzareth smirked. Vadrath, the corsair's gambit. The docks of Clare Karond were alive with shadowy deals and whispered betrayals. Beneath the towering black iron cliffs, the sea lapped hungrily against the hulls of corsair ships, their decks manned by killers who owed allegiance to nothing but gold and slaughter. Vadrath stepped lightly through the corsair stronghold, his movements effortless, weaving through cutthroats and traitors as if he belonged among them. Which, of course, he did. At the center of the docks, within a gilded chamber of plundered wealth, sat Captain Rajak Fellblade, a monstrous figure, his face half hidden beneath a helm fashioned from the skull of a sea drake. Vadrath bowed low, but his smirk never wavered. "My dear captain," he purred, "I believe I have an offer you cannot refuse." Rajak leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "That's so." Vadrath poured himself a goblet of spiced Naggarothi wine, taking a slow sip before continuing. My brother sits upon a very large and very well-fortified fortress," he mused. "And my dear sister, well, she's cavorting with witch-elves who think of us all as little more than living sacrifices." Rajak chuckled darkly. "And what do you offer that's worth the risk of crossing them?" Vadrath set down his goblet, his smirk widening. "Malzareth wages war with iron. Avarice drowns herself in blood. Xelthara dabbles in things better left untouched. But me?" He spread his hands. "I offer coin. I offer plunder. I offer a kingdom of trade built on blades and whispers." Rajak grinned, revealing jagged, yellowed teeth. "That I can work with." Avris, the temple of Cain. The witch-elves of Herganeth did not give their favor easily. Avris knew that. She knelt within the temple of Cain, the air thick with the stench of blood and something far darker. The flickering torchlight illuminated painted murals of sacrifice and carnage, depictions of Cain's wrath and the slaughter of the weak. Before her stood Hag Queen Vathis, a figure wreathed in black and crimson, her eyes as empty as the grave. "You seek the favor of the brides of Cain," the queen murmured. "But have you paid the price?" Avarice did not hesitate. She reached for the silver dagger at her belt, gripping the blade without fear. A single swift cut across her palm, and blood pooled upon the temple floor. She turned her hand over, letting it drip into the sacred font of Cain, where the divine will of the bloody-handed god was made known. The blood rippled, the liquid shifting, forming shapes and symbols that only the most devout could interpret. Hag Queen Vathis smiled, stepping closer, her fingers brushing across Aver's cheek with something akin to affection. "Or hunger." "Khaine sees you," she whispered. The other witch-elves in the chamber began to chant, their blades flashing in the torchlight. Everest closed her eyes, letting the ritual wash over her. She did not need armies. She needed only faith. And faith in the name of Cain was bought with murder. Xelthara, the forbidden path. The ruins of Anatharima's lost sanctum had long been abandoned. Here, among crumbling stone and forgotten whispers, Xelthara worked her craft. The torches burned a sickly violet, the flames unnatural. The air crackled with forbidden magic, the scent of incense and death hanging in the chamber like a funeral shroud. Before her, the ritual circle pulsed, the runes upon the floor writhing, shifting, as if alive. She stood at the edge of the abyss, her lips moving in a language that should not be spoken. The darkness before her shuddered. Something stirred. A voice, soft as silk, cold as death, whispered from the void. "You dare to call upon me?" Xelthara smiled. She was not afraid. She had never been afraid. Her siblings built armies, fleets, and cults. She would build something far greater, something they could not kill, something eternal. The council is formed. The war had gone quiet, but it had not stopped. Malzareth gathered his warriors. Vaedrith secured his corsairs. Avaris called upon the brides of Cain. Xelthara made her unholy pact. The council of vipers had risen, and when they struck, Naggar itself would tremble. Chapter 7. The First Battle. The cold streets of Naggaroth were slick with rain, the black stone glistening under the pale light of the twin moons. High above, the spires of the city of cold steel clawed at the heavens like jagged knives, casting long shadows across the labyrinthine alleys below. But tonight, the darkness was not empty. Tonight, war had come to the heart of Naggaroth. Steel in the shadows. The clash began in the merchant quarter, where the nobles of Nagdaron trafficked in pleasure, pain, and power. Malzara's forces had moved in secret, a unit of hardened warriors clad in blackened armor, their eyes scanning the streets with ruthless efficiency. They had come to eliminate a threat, to send a message to Vaedrith that his schemes would not go unanswered. But Vaedrith had always been one step ahead. The moment Malzareth's soldiers entered the quarter, the assassins struck. Shades moved through the darkness like wraiths, their cloaks swallowing the flickering torchlight. Crossbows loosed from hidden rooftops, bolts tipped with black lotus venom sinking into unguarded throats. The first soldier went down without a sound, his body crumpling into the gutter. Then another. Then the screams began. The battle begins. Malzareth's warriors were no mere city guards. They were battle-hardened killers, men who had survived raids on Ulthuan, sieges against chaos, and years upon years of slaughter. They did not break. "Shields up!" the captain bellowed, his voice slicing through the chaos. The warriors formed a tight shield wall, blocking the alleyway, their blackened blades gleaming as they waited for the next assault. The assassins moved again, dropping from the rooftops with daggers drawn. One landed silently behind a soldier, slicing cleanly through his throat before vanishing into the fog. Another lunged, only for a spear to catch him mid-air, impaling him through the ribs. The battle spilled out into the main square, the clash of steel against steel ringing through the streets. Malzareth's men fought with brutal precision, but Vaedrith's assassins were ghosts, striking and vanishing before they could be countered. The rain pounded against the blood-slick stone, washing away the dead even as more bodies fell. And then the horns sounded. A warning, a command, a decree of death, the Drachau's edict. The air grew still, despite the battle raging on. Then came the mounted knights. The Black Guard of Naggaroth, the Witch King's personal enforcers, swept into the streets with terrifying swiftness, their halberds gleaming beneath the moonlight. Their leader, Drachau Nathir, rode at their head, his crimson-plumed helm stark against the obsidian plate of his armor. Enough. The voice cracked through the night like a whip. The combatants froze, swords still raised, breath still ragged. The Drachau steed, a monstrous cold one, snorted, steam rising from its flaring nostrils as it surveyed the bloodied street. Varith's golden eyes swept over the carnage, his gaze falling on the corpses littering the cobbled road. The look of disgust in his eyes was unmistakable. "You dare bring your petty war to the streets of the Witch King's city?" Malzareth wiped blood from his blade, meeting the Drachau's gaze without fear. An unfortunate misunderstanding. Vaedrith, who had remained unseen until now, emerged from the shadows, his expression one of theatrical innocence. "A tragedy, truly," he murmured. "I came here for nothing but a simple exchange of words, and yet, somehow, my dear brother's men started dying. How strange." The Drachau's expression darkened. "You are all fools," he spat. He turned his gaze toward the gathered soldiers and assassins. By Malekith's will, I do not care which of you wins your miserable war, but you will not wage it in his city." The knights behind him shifted, their halberds lowering, their intent clear. Malzareth exhaled slowly, forcing himself to step back. This was not the time. Vaedrith, ever the actor, bowed low, flourishing his hands in mock apology. "Of course, Drachau. We live to serve." The blackguard remained still, watching. The Drachau's voice turned to ice. "If this happens again, I will kill all of you myself." A silence, heavier than iron chains, settled between them. The message was clear. This was not a retreat. This was not a peace. This was a warning, and if they ignored it, the next battle would be their last. The aftermath. As the blackguard withdrew, the survivors did the same. Malzareth's warriors carried their wounded back to Karond-Vael. Vaedrith's assassins melted into the shadows once more. But none of them were walking away as they had come. Something had changed. Vaedrith had seen his brother's forces firsthand. They were strong, disciplined, and unshaken. He would need more than whispers and knives to kill Malzareth. And Malzareth had seen Vaedrith's assassins in action. They were ghosts, striking from nowhere, evading even the most trained soldiers. He could not fight an enemy he could not see. Both knew they needed more. More allies, more power, more control. The war had truly begun, and the next time they met, Naggaroth's streets would run red with blood. Chapter 8. The Kiss of Cain. The Temple of Cain loomed in the heart of Harganeth, a monument of cruelty and devotion. Its spires rose like blades thrust into the heavens, jagged and stained with centuries of sacrifice. The air was thick with a scent of blood and burning incense, the sacred aroma of offerings made in the name of the bloody-handed god. Tonight the halls would drink deeply once more. The sacrificial rite. Avery stood in the center of the blood-drenched sanctum, her robes already soaked in crimson. Before her, bound in chains of barbed iron, knelt 13 victims, their mouths gagged, their eyes wild with fear. Drachau noblemen, captured corsairs, and even one unfortunate shade, each had been chosen carefully. Each had been taken from Vaedrith's ranks. Above them, the hag queen Vaethys watched in approval, her form draped in ceremonial crimson, her face untouched by time, yet filled with an inhuman hunger. "Cain watches, child," the hag queen whispered, her voice reverberating through the chamber. "And he is pleased." Ievris nodded, stepping forward. She held the sacrificial dagger high, its curved obsidian blade whispering in the torchlight. The temple hummed with energy, the distant chants of brides of Cain rising into a fevered crescendo. The victims thrashed, but the chains held tight. One by one she approached each of them. One by one she offered their lives to the god of murder. The first throat was cut, blood spilled. The torches flared, burning hotter. The second, the third. With each sacrifice, the hymns grew louder, the walls vibrating with power, with hunger, with something beyond mortal understanding. The 9th, the 10th. By the time the 12th victim's heart ceased beating, the air was alive with whispers. Not from the mortal world, but from something else. Avris turned to the final offering. A corsair captain, his eyes burning with fury even as his lips remained gagged. "This one," Avris murmured, placing her dagger at his throat. "I offer with purpose. Let his death be a vow, a declaration of war." The hag queen smiled, stepping closer. "Then it is done." Avris slit his throat, and as his blood gushed forth, the ritual circle ignited, the power of Cain himself roaring to life. A whisper slid through her mind, cold as steel, hot as fire. "I see you, child, and I accept." Then, the brides of Cain stepped forward. The ritual was complete. The war had begun. The ambush. Vadrath had been summoned to a meeting deep within the underbelly of Karond, a place of smuggling and secrecy. He moved through the darkened corridors of the corsair enclave, his closest allies flanking him, warriors and assassins who had bled for him, killed for him, and would die for him if necessary. It would be necessary. The moment he entered the courtyard, the air changed. A whisper of silk on steel. Then screams. The brides of Cain descended like specters, their ceremonial daggers glinting in the moonlight, their eyes filled with divine madness. The first assassin never saw his killer, only a flash of red before his throat was torn open. The second managed to parry a strike, only to have his heart carved from his chest in one swift motion. Vadrath reacted instantly, drawing his twin daggers in a blur of movement, cutting down the first attacker who came too close. But this was no ordinary skirmish. This was slaughter. One by one, his closest allies fell beneath the blades of the brides, their movements too fast, too precise, enhanced by the blessings of Cain himself. Vadrath killed 3, then 4, then 5, his daggers painting the stones red, but it was not enough. There were too many. And then he saw her. Standing above the carnage, watching with cold amusement, was Avarice. She had not come to fight. She had come to watch him lose. Vadrath's last remaining guard screamed as 2 brides tore him apart, and then he was alone. His breath ragged, his daggers dripping crimson, he locked eyes with Avarice. She smiled. "How does it feel, dear brother?" she mused. "To have everything you've built taken in an instant?" Vadrath wiped blood from his cheek, his smirk returning, though there was murder in his gaze. "Bold," he admitted. "But you've made a mistake." Avarice raised an eyebrow. "Oh? You should have killed me too." And then Vadrath vanished into the shadows. Avarice let out a soft chuckle, stepping over the bodies of his fallen men. She turned to the Hag Queen beside her. "It is done," she murmured. The Hag Queen nodded. "Then we await his counterstrike." Avarice glanced back toward the darkness, where Vadrath had disappeared. "Let him come," she whispered. Her fingers still tingled with divine power, the blood of the sacrificed still warm on her skin. Cain had accepted her, and soon so would Naggaroth. Chapter 9. The Scions of Slaanesh. The darkest paths are not taken in a moment. They are walked slowly, each step deeper, each whisper softer, each temptation sweeter. For Xelthara, it had begun as a curiosity, a flicker of something forbidden, a question unanswered, a door left slightly ajar. Now it was too late to turn back. The descent. The cult of the Crimson Ecstasy did not reside in palaces or temples. It was not found in the great spires of Naggaroth, nor in the grand courts of Grond. It thrived in the shadows, beneath the city, in the tunnels where even the assassins feared to tread. Xelthar moved through the glistening cavern halls, her bare feet silent upon the cold stone. The walls pulsed as though alive, throbbing in time with the unnatural drum beats that echoed from the depths. She could feel it. The precedence. Something ancient, something watching. The air was thick with perfume and decay, a scent that made her head swim, her pulse quicken, her senses sharpen beyond mortal comprehension. And then they emerged. Figures cloaked in translucent silks, their faces masked in gold and ivory, their movements languid, predatory, inhuman. "You have come, little sister," one whispered, her voice a song that wrapped itself around Xelthara's mind like a lover's embrace. Xelthar did not flinch. She knew what she was doing. She had been left with nothing. Her father's death had thrown the house into chaos. Her siblings had taken fortresses, warriors, fleets, and gods. But they had left her powerless. No longer. She knelt, pressing her forehead to the cold, pulsing stone beneath her. "I seek the favor of the Dark Prince," she whispered. The cultists laughed, a sound both delightful and dreadful. "Then you must offer more than words, dear one." From the darkness, something moved. The pact. It was not a ritual of chanting and flame. It was intimate, carnal, consuming. The cult surrounded her, hands brushing across her skin, their whispers melting into her mind, unraveling everything she had been and remaking her into something more. She saw visions. Pleasure beyond comprehension, pain beyond meaning, the whispers of demons, the laughter of Slaanesh himself, curling around her soul like silk and steel. The mark of the Dark Prince burned upon her flesh, but she did not scream. She embraced it. She became it. And when she rose from the altar, her breath ragged, her heart hammering, she was not the same. The return. When Xelthar returned to Karond-Vael, she did not walk. She glided, her form unnaturally fluid, her eyes gleaming with a violet light that pulsed in time with something unseen. Her skin was flawless, too flawless, like polished marble come to life. Her smile lingered too long. She was no longer simply Druki. She was something more. Something wrong? Malzareth was the first to notice it. He stood in the war hall, surrounded by his commanders, discussing the next campaign against Vaedrith's forces. Then the doors opened. She entered, flanked by two figures cloaked in silk, their bodies shifting unnaturally, their smiles too wide, their fingers too long. The room fell silent. Even the most hardened warriors felt the shift, the unseen pressure in the air, as though reality itself had become softer around her. Malzareth's grip tightened on his sword. "Have you done?" Xelthar laughed. Not the cold, sharp laughter of the Druki. "No." The sound was syrupy, musical, laced with something unclean, something that coiled in the depths of the mind and demanded to be heard. "I have simply accepted what was always meant to be." Her voice was too smooth, too sweet, like a melody played on an instrument made of skin and bone. Vaedrith stepped from the shadows, his daggers already drawn. "You reek of something wrong." Avris tilted her head, eyes narrowed. "What are you?" Xelthar smiled. "I am the future." And then she moved. Faster than sight. Before Vaedrith could react, she was beside him, her fingers brushing his cheek. His breath caught, his vision swam, his muscles went weak, a sensation unlike anything he had ever felt before. Not poison. Not magic. Something worse. Something whispering into his soul, pulling him closer, demanding surrender. He staggered away, gasping, his hands trembling. Xelthar simply watched, amused. Avris exhaled slowly, her grip tightening on the dagger at her waist. "This war was already madness, sister. You have made it worse." Xelthar took a step forward and they all instinctively stepped back. Even Malzareth. She saw it, she felt it, and she smiled. "Then let the madness begin." And from the halls beyond, the laughter of demons echoed in the dark. Chapter 10. The Corsair's Betrayal. The Sea of Malice was calm that night. Too calm. The waves lapped gently against the black hulls of the Corsair fleet, their dark sails billowing softly in the cold Naggarothi wind. The Kraken's Maw, the flagship of Captain Rajak Fellblade, cut through the waters like a hungry beast, its decks alive with murmured conversations, the glint of polished steel, and the ever-present scent of salt and blood. Vaedrith stood at the prow, his cloak snapping in the wind, his daggers resting easy at his hips. He should have felt at ease. But something was wrong. His instincts, honed through decades of betrayal and assassination, were whispering to him. It was too quiet, too easy. He turned his gaze toward Rajak, who stood near the helm, his massive frame cloaked in shadows, his sea drake skull helm concealing his expression. Vaedrith narrowed his eyes. Something was coming, and he would not like it. The blade in the back. The betrayal came swiftly. A single hand signal from Rajak and everything changed. The corsairs turned, weapons flashing. The murmured conversations stopped, replaced by the cold ring of steel being drawn. Vaedrith's own men, those he had trusted, those he had bled with, stepped back, their allegiances suddenly uncertain. The deck was no longer his. "It seems you overplayed your hand, Vaedrith," Rajak rumbled, stepping forward, his great black axe resting against his shoulder. Vaedrith's grip tightened around his daggers, but he did not move. Not yet. "This is how it is then." His voice was calm, his smirk still in place. "You make a deal, take my coin, and then decide you want everything for yourself?" Rajak laughed, deep and cruel. "You always thought yourself the clever one, Vaedrith," he said, "but you forgot the first rule of the sea." He gestured to the corsairs who had once called Vaedrith their leader. "Loyalty belongs only to those who hold the power. And you are standing on my deck." Vaedrith chuckled, though his mind was already calculating. Escape routes, kill counts, the distance to the nearest ship. The odds were against him. So be it. He lunged. His daggers flashed as he closed the distance between them, his blades aimed for Rajak's throat. But the captain was ready. The massive axe swung up, intercepting Vaedrith's strike, the force of the blow sending him staggering back. "Not so fast," Rajak growled. Vaedrith snarled, adjusting his stance. "Then let's make this interesting." The fall of Vaedrith. The fight was swift and brutal. Vaedrith was fast, faster than any corsair on that deck. His daggers sang through the air, carving through flesh, spilling dark blood onto the wooden planks. But there were too many of them. For every corsair he killed, another took their place. He moved like a shadow in the storm, evading, countering, striking, but the tide was against him. A boot slammed into his chest, sending him crashing against the railing. He gasped for breath, pain blooming in his ribs as he forced himself up, only to feel the cold edge of Rajak's axe press against his throat. "You should have stayed in the shadows, boy," Rajak said, his voice filled with amusement. "You never belonged at sea." Vaedrith gritted his teeth, blood dripping from his lip. He had one chance. "Maybe," he admitted. Then he moved. In a blur of motion he twisted, kicking out, knocking Rajak's legs from under him. The axe swung wide, giving Vaedrith just enough space to roll backward onto the railing. One chance. One escape. He turned and jumped. The last thing he heard before he hit the freezing sea was Rajak's laughter. Strained. The waves closed around him, cold and uncaring. Vaedrith fought against the drag of the water, his muscles burning as he forced himself to the surface. Above, the Kraken's maw loomed, its dark sails already turning away. They had left him to drown. But he was not dead yet. The cold bit into his bones as he swam, forcing himself toward the distant shoreline, where the jagged cliffs of Naggaroth's wilderness awaited. By the time he dragged himself onto the rocky shore, his body was numb, battered, exhausted. But his mind was alive with one thought. Revenge? Rajak had taken his fleet. Rajak had taken his allies. But Vaedrith was not finished. He looked toward the mountains beyond, where the shade clans of the Black Spine waited, hidden among the shadows. He would find them. He would rebuild. And when he returned, he would not come with offers of gold or whispered promises. He would come with knives, and Rashak Fellblade would drown in his own blood. Chapter 11. The Beastmaster's Wrath. The air over Karond-Vael was thick with the stench of blood, scales, and raw meat. Here, among the towering cliffs and caged monstrosities, the beastmasters ruled. They did not govern through wealth or titles, nor did they scheme like the nobles of Naggaroth. Their power was far older, built on a foundation of domination and control, the eternal struggle between master and beast. And today, Malzareth had come to claim that power. The deal with monsters. The great hall of Karond-Vael was unlike any throne room in Naggaroth. There were no banners, no gold, no trophies of conquests. There was only the stench of beasts and the ever-present sound of chains rattling in the darkness. Malzareth stood before Overseer Korak, a man more monster than elf, his face scarred by 1,000 failed taming attempts, his arms covered in ritual cuts that oozed black ichor. Behind him, a manticore the size of a war chariot growled, its blackened mane bristling, its eyes glowing with barely restrained fury. "You ask much, Malzareth," Korak rumbled, his voice deep as the abyss. "The beasts do not fight for kings or crowns. They fight for their masters, and we do not give freely." Malzareth met his gaze without flinching. "I did not come to ask," he said. "I came to take." Korak's smile was a jagged thing, full of broken teeth. "Then prove yourself." The manticore lunged, taming the storm. Malzareth moved as the beast struck, its claws carving through the air where he had stood only moments before. The watching beastmasters whispered among themselves, some amused, some eager to see him torn apart. Malzareth drew no blade. Instead, he held his ground. The manticore twisted, its venomous tail lashing toward his throat, but he sidestepped, moving with predatory precision. The beast circled him, testing, searching for weakness. "Do you think brute strength will tame me?" Malzareth murmured, his voice calm, measured, absolute. He met the beast's eyes, and then he spoke. Not with words, but with will, domination. The manticore's growl became a whimper. It snarled, resisting, but the more it fought, the deeper Malzareth's presence pushed into its mind. The watching beastmasters fell silent. Korak's smile faded, and then the manticore knelt, its massive head bowed low, its wings folding in submission. Malzareth stepped forward, placing a hand upon its skull. "You belong to me now." The room erupted in roars and cheers, but Korak only laughed darkly. "You have my beasts, Malzareth," he rumbled. "May they bring destruction to your enemies." The ambush. Abris and her witch-elf cultists moved through the cursed glades of Harganeth, their dark Pegasi circling above, their weapons ready. She had known Malzareth would come. She had not expected him to bring nightmares with him. The attack came without warning. The first scream came from the sky as a rider was ripped from her dark Pegasus mid-slate, a war hydra's jaws clamping down upon her body, shaking her like a rag doll before hurling her lifeless form into the trees. Avris turned, barking orders, but the forest itself was moving. A blackened manticore crashed through the tree line, its claws carving through a screeching witch-elf, her body torn apart before she could even strike back. Then the cavalry came. Malzareth's beastmaster riders surged forward, each mounted upon scaled horrors, their weapons gleaming as they descended upon Avris' forces. The witch-elves fought savagely, their blades singing in the night, their bloodlust feeding Cain's hunger, but against creatures bred for war, mortal steel meant nothing. Avris raised a hand, her magic crackling, a curse forming upon her lips. And then Malzareth was upon her, brother against sister. Their blades met in the dark, steel screaming against steel. Malzareth's strength was relentless, his attacks hammering down upon her like a storm of iron. Avarice was faster, her movements fluid, weaving through the chaos, but she could not break his defenses. "Is this your grand army?" Malzareth mocked between strikes. "A few zealots and their pets?" Avarice smirked, twisting away. "Better than brainless beasts." She lunged, her dagger slicing a thin line across his cheek. Malzareth's eyes flashed, his patience gone. His manticore leapt forward, its claws aimed for her throat. Avas vanished into shadow, reappearing just beyond its reach, breathing hard. "What?" The battle still raged, but she could see the truth. She was losing. Her forces were being torn apart, her Pegasi dropping from the sky, her warriors crushed beneath monstrous talons and snapping jaws. She gritted her teeth. This is not over. And with that, she disappeared into the night. The aftermath. The battlefield was silent. The ground was littered with broken bodies, the scent of blood heavy in the air. Malzareth stood among the ruins, his manticore by his side, its eyes still gleaming with hunger. He had won, but he did not celebrate. Avars was still alive, and the next time they met, she would not run. She would come with something worse, something even Cain could not stop. Chapter 12. The Ashen Vows. The sanctum of the Hag Queens was no temple. It was no place of worship or sanctuary. It was a monument to agony, a shrine bathed in suffering and steel. The walls of Harganeth's inner sanctum were fashioned not from stone, but from bone, fused together with dark magic and the whispered curses of the dying. Every inch of the chamber was stained crimson, the very air thick with a scent of spilled blood, as if the fortress itself breathed the echoes of murder. And here, beneath the watchful gaze of the Hag Queens, Avarice knelt. Her body bore the wounds of her failure, the cuts and bruises from her battle with Malzareth, the weight of her lost warriors, her fallen sisters. She had failed, but she had not been broken. Not yet. The Hag Queen Morveth stood before her, draped in robes woven from the flayed skin of the unworthy, her black eyes bottomless pits of judgment. "You have come, daughter of Cain," the Hag Queen whispered, her voice a serpent's hiss. "You seek power, but you have already been given Cain's gifts. You spilled blood, you killed, you lost. What more do you desire?" Avarice lifted her chin, her voice steady despite the pain. "I desire to become more." The other witch-elves in the chamber whispered among themselves, their daggers gleaming in the blood-red torchlight. Hag Queen Morveth smiled, though the expression was cold, cruel. "More," she echoed, "and what will you offer in return?" Avarice did not hesitate. She lifted the dagger at her belt, her own ceremonial blade, its edge still slick with the blood of the sacrifices she had given before. And then she drove it into her own flesh. A gasp rippled through the temple as she cut deep, her face blank with pain as dark blood welled from the wound. A sacrifice. A vow. An offering. "I offer myself," she whispered. "Take what is needed. Make me worthy." The Hag Queen's smile widened. "Then let the ritual begin." The trial of flesh. Avarice was stripped of her armor, of her weapons, of everything but the pain. The brides of Cain surrounded her, blades flashing, carving intricate runes into her skin, symbols of devotion, of agony, of power. She did not scream. Even as the metal bit into her, even as her lifeblood pooled at her feet, she remained silent. Then came the fire. The cauldron at the heart of the sanctum bubbled with something thicker than blood, darker than ink, its surface shifting with the faces of the long dead. The witch-elves chanted, their voices rising in a crescendo of madness. The Hag Queen took Avarice by the throat, her grip iron-song, her breath cold as the grave. Khaine does not give lightly, she whispered. He demands that which is most precious. Avra's pulse thundered. She knew what was coming, and she did not resist. With a single brutal motion, the Hag Queen plunged Avris into the cauldron. The liquid engulfed her. It burned, it seared, it consumed. Avris did not scream. She laughed. The cauldron shook, the chamber quaking with unnatural power as the dark magic of Cain's chosen seeped into her very bones. She felt herself breaking apart, her mind fracturing, her body becoming something else, something unrecognizable. And then, the silence. The cauldron stilled. The witch elves took a step back. And slowly, Avris emerged. The rebirth. The woman who rose from the cauldron was not the same. Her flesh was no longer simply flesh. It was ash and fire, blood and shadow, a thing reborn in the embrace of Cain himself. Her skin was etched with burning runes, the symbols of sacrifice and slaughter carved so deep they glowed with unholy light. Her eyes burned red, no longer simply mortal, but divine in their rage. The dagger she had once carried was gone, melted into her very being. Now, when she raised her hand, a blade of pure blood fire flickered to life at her command. She flexed her fingers, feeling the raw power coursing through her, the strength of Cain singing in her veins. The Hag Queen laughed, delighted. "Rise, daughter of slaughter. You are no longer merely Avris." She stepped forward, placing a cold, clawed hand upon Avra's brow. "You are now the ashen saint of Cain." Avery smiled, and the chamber trembled. The war resumes. When Avris returned to her forces, they stared in horror and awe. The woman they had followed before was gone. In her place stood something greater, something unstoppable. Her very presence filled the air with bloodlust, a whisper in the minds of her warriors, a demand for sacrifice. And they would gladly obey. She turned toward the south, toward Malzarah's fortress, her hands clenching into fists of flame and death. The last time they had fought, he had crushed her. This time, she would burn his world to the ground. Chapter 13. The Cursed Blade. The whispers began the moment she touched it. Deep beneath Karond-Vael, within the forgotten catacombs where even the most arrogant Drachau dared not tread, Xelthar found the relic. A sword. It lay within an ancient stone sarcophagus, untouched for centuries, surrounded by the withered corpses of those who had tried to claim it before. Their bodies were twisted, blackened, drained of all essence, their faces frozen in expressions of silent agony. And yet, as Xelthar approached, the blade hummed, as if it had been waiting for her. She should have left it. She should have walked away. Instead, she reached out, and the world shattered. The whispering dark. The moment her fingers brushed the obsidian hilt, the air grew thick, heavy with a power that did not belong to mortals. A sudden coldness seeped into her bones, not of ice, but of absence, of something missing, something stolen. And then she heard it. The voice. It slithered into her mind, velvet soft, smooth as a lover's sigh. "You are not afraid." The chamber melted away, the walls dissolving into an endless void of shifting shadows and violet flame. She stood alone, the blade now alive in her grasp, pulsing with a dark hunger, its black steel etched with runes that twisted and moved, forming words she could not yet understand. "You are strong." She saw visions of her siblings broken at her feet, of Malzarah impaled upon this very blade, his lifeblood seeping into the ruins of Karond-Vael. She saw Avris screaming, the fire in her eyes extinguished, her once holy flesh crumbling into ash beneath her touch. She saw Vaedrith strangled in his own shadows, the last of his breath stolen away by her hand. She could have it all. The whispers coiled around her mind, seeping into the fractures, filling them with honeyed promises and poisoned truths. She wanted to resist. She did not. The blade sank deeper into her thoughts, its presence wrapping around her like an embrace, soothing, suffocating. "Let me in, and I will show you how to win." Xelthar exhaled slowly. And then she allowed it. The unraveling. By the time she returned to the surface, Xelthar was no longer the same. Her movements were too fluid, too precise, as though her body had been rewritten. Her voice, when she spoke, echoed, layered with something else, something older. The few retainers who dared approach her recoiled, their instincts screaming that something unnatural now walked among them. She did not sleep. She did not need to. When she closed her eyes, she saw nothing but the blade. And it saw. It whispered secrets of the past, of power stolen and hoarded, of Malekith's forgotten sorcery, locked away for fear of what it could do. It showed her the truth. She was no longer Drachau. She was something more, something incomplete, something that hungered. The blade's hunger. Her first test came swiftly. A prisoner. A captured beastmaster, one of Malzareth's scouts, dragged before her, broken and defiant. He spat at her feet, his chains rattling. "You think you frighten me?" he sneered. "I've faced horrors greater than whatever sorcery you've dabbled in." Xelthar simply smiled. Then, without hesitation, she plunged the blade into his chest. The reaction was instant. His body convulsed, a soundless scream tearing from his throat as the blade fed. His veins blackened, his eyes widening in horror as his very essence was devoured, siphoned into the weapon's insatiable core. And when she pulled the sword free, there was nothing left. Not a body, not a soul, just emptiness. She shivered, her breath unsteady, not in fear, but in ecstasy. The blade was not just a weapon. It was a parasite, and she had become its host. The others begin to fear. Word of Xelthar's change spread. Malzareth's spies reported back with uncertainty, whispers of her newfound power, her unnatural movements, the way her presence seemed to warp the very air. Evris, still reeling from her own transformation, felt something watching her in the night, something that felt wrong even to her blood-stained soul. And Vedrith, hidden in the wilderness, felt the shadows recoil from her presence, as though they too feared the thing she was becoming. None of them understood. Not yet. But soon they would, because the blade had given her a gift, and soon it would demand a price. Chapter 14. The Return of Vedrith. The dead do not return. That was the whisper in Naggaroth's courts. That was the comfort Malzareth, Evris, and Xelthar had taken when Vedrith was cast into the sea, betrayed by corsairs, stripped of his fleet, left to drown beneath the freezing tides. But the Blackspine Mountains tell no tales, and neither do the Shades. The Black Pact. The Blackspine Mountains were older than Naggaroth itself, a jagged, monstrous expanse where even the Witch King's authority faltered. Here, among the crumbling ruins of forgotten temples and unspeakable horrors, the Shade clans ruled. They were no simple assassins, no mere Drachau rebels. They were something else. A people who had long abandoned the cities of their kin, who had chosen exile over servitude, who had made the shadows their throne. And it was here, deep in the mountain passes where sunlight never touched, that Vedrith made his bargain. "Give me your blades," he had whispered to their chieftain, "and I will give you a war unlike any before." The Shapes did not laugh. They did not refuse. For they saw something in him, something that had been broken and reforged in the dark, something that had drowned and crawled back from the abyss. And so they gave him what he needed, Men, weapons, the silent death of the mountains. And in return, he gave them blood, the night of the knives. It began with whispers. Malzare's fortress was secure, his army stronger than ever, his war beasts freshly fed on the corpses of Averis' slain warriors. He had conquered her once, and soon he would crush her completely. But on the eve of his next campaign, something changed. His generals stopped reporting in. The beast masters of Karond-Vael, those who had marched beside him, who had tamed his hydras, his manticores, his war dragons, were found slaughtered in their chambers. Not by blade, not by poison, but by shadows. Their throats were slit so cleanly, their deaths so silent, that their guards had stood watch until morning, unaware their masters were already corpses. Malzare awoke to find his second-in-command pinned to his throne, his own sword driven through his chest, his dead eyes staring at nothing. And on the blade, a single black feather, the mark of the shades, the mark of Vaedrith. The war shifts. Averis' remaining cultists, still reeling from their defeat in the beast-ridden forests, barely had time to regroup before their high priestess was taken. Not by Malzareth's monsters, but by something colder. The witch-elves found her body draped over Cain's altar, not sacrificed, not butchered, but simply gone, her essence drained, her face a mask of horror. Another black feather, resting atop her ashen lips. Vaedrith did not announce his return with banners or war cries. He did not raise armies, did not storm fortresses. He simply began to remove the pieces, one by one, until Malzareth's commanders no longer trusted their own shadows, until Averis' priestesses feared to pray in the dark, until Xelthara's warlocks heard whispers of something they did not understand, something that could not be corrupted. Something older than their newfound powers, something colder than the abyss. The ghost in the dark. And then he showed himself. In the grand hall of Karond-Vael, where Malzareth held his war councils, where his remaining commanders whispered of the unseen assassin that hunted them, the torches sputtered. The air grew still. The guards did not see him enter. Only when Malzareth turned, blade drawn, breath ragged, fury barely restrained, did he see the figure leaning against the far pillar, arms crossed, smirk in place, as if he had never left. "Did you miss me, dear brother?" The room exploded into motion. Blades were drawn, warriors surged forward. But Vaedrith was already moving. One step, a flick of his wrist. The first guard fell, throat cut before he could even register the strike. Another lunged. Vaedrith twisted, stepping behind him, dagger sliding through ribs, whispering past lungs, tearing into his heart. He let the body fall as he locked eyes with Malzareth. "Your generals are gone." His voice was calm, measured, absolute. "Your war beasts no longer answer your call." He took a step forward, the shades emerging from the shadows behind him, their blades still slick with Malzareth's men's blood. "Ensu," Vaedrith smiled. "Neither will your army." Malzareth's grip tightened on his sword. But this was no longer his war. This was Vaedrith's game now, and he had only just begun to play. Chapter 15. The Siege of Karond-Vael. The storm had come at last. For weeks the banners of House Xelthar had flown over Karond-Vael, the last stronghold of Malzareth's reign. But now they hung tattered and torn, battered by the howling winds that swept in from the Sea of Malice. Outside its towering obsidian walls, the armies had gathered. Not one army, not two, but three. The factions that had spent months tearing each other apart had finally turned toward a single target, and now Malzareth stood alone, his back to the wall, the fortress that had once been his greatest strength, now a cage of his own making. The war was no longer about succession. It was about who would be left standing when the dawn broke, if dawn ever came at all. The forces gather. The battlefield stretched like a black sea, shifting with the countless figures who had come to see Karond-Vael fall. At the head of the Eastern army, draped in robes of crimson and black, her skin etched with the burning runes of sacrifice, stood Eowris, the ashen saint of Cain. She did not lead mortal warriors. She led fanatics. A tide of witch-elves, their bodies slick with ritual blood, their golden eyes burning with divine madness. Behind them stood the hag queens of Harganeth, their presence alone turning the very air thick with power, their whispers promising slaughter beyond reckoning. From the south, the shadows had come. Vaedrith's shades had moved unseen through the cliffs, their silent forms taking their positions, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The black banners of the Shade clans fluttered in the wind, their archers already hidden among the rocks, their knives thirsting for the blood of their kin. And from the west, the air rippled with something unnatural. Xelthar had arrived. Her forces were not soldiers. They were warlocks and nightmares, figures wrapped in veils of twisting sorcery, their bodies moving with inhuman grace, their whispers thick with the voice of something far older than them all. Her personal guard, the scions of Slaanesh, stood among them, their lithe forms shifting between beauty and horror, their weapons humming with hunger. The fortress had been surrounded. Malzareth stood atop the battlements, his black armor soaked in the cold rain, his jaw set, his grip on his sword unyielding. He was outnumbered. He was outmatched. And yet he did not run, because Malzareth was not a man who fled. He was a man who fought, and if this was to be his last stand, then he would make it one for the ages. Betrayal upon betrayal. The first assault came at nightfall. Eowris's witch-elves surged forward, their screams filling the night, their blades flashing in the torchlight as they scaled the walls with impossible speed. Malzareth's warriors met them with savage resistance, their blades cleaving through the frenzied assassins, but for every one they cut down, two more took their place. From the shadows, Vaedrith's assassins moved, slipping through the cracks of the fortress, opening hidden gates, cutting throats in the dark. But even as the defenders faltered, something else moved. Inside the fortress, among Malzareth's own ranks, the whispers of Xelthara's corruption had already spread. One by one, his lieutenants turned against him. One by one, they fell to her will. By the time he realized the truth, it was already too late. The breaking of the gate. With a single, deafening boom, the gates of Karond-Vael exploded inward, shattered by Xelthara's sorcery. Her scions poured in first, their inhuman forms flickering between the material and the impossible, their blades singing with laughter as they danced through the slaughter. Eowris followed, her warriors pressing the advantage, their devotion to Cain turning the battle into a ritual of carnage. And then, finally, came Vaedrith. The archers on the walls fell silent, their throats slit, their blood dripping onto the stone below. The gatehouse fell. The battlements burned. The fortress was collapsing. And yet, at the heart of it all, Malzareth stood. A warlord born of fire and blood, standing atop the highest tower, watching as his fortress, his legacy, crumbled beneath him. This was not a defeat. This was the final test. He turned, his black sword glinting, his eyes burning with something deeper than fury. He had lost his army. He had lost his war. But he was not dead yet. And before the night was over, he would make them bleed for every inch of his ruin. The final battle begins. As the fires of Karond-Vael rose into the storm-torn sky, the four remaining heirs of House Xelthar stood at the brink of annihilation. None of them trusted the others. None of them intended to share the victory, and yet each knew only one would leave this place alive. Avery stepped forward, her blade dripping red, her smile twisted in divine rapture. Vaydrith emerged from the shadows, daggers spinning in his hands, his expression unreadable, calculating, amused. Xelthar walked through the smoke, the cursed blade at her hip whispering its dark promises, her violet eyes empty of anything remotely mortal. And Malzareth stood above them all, his grip on his sword unyielding, his armor shattered, his breath slow but certain. The battle was not over. Not yet, because the true reckoning had just begun. Chapter 16. The Madness of Xelthara. The sky above Karond-Vael had turned unnatural. Lightning split the heavens, but the flashes were not white or blue, they were violet, black, sickly green, colors that should not exist, twisting through the storm like the veins of some dying god. The battlefield had been a war zone. Now it was a nightmare. At its heart stood Xelthara, or what was left of her. The blade's will. She had stood atop the ruined battlements, the cursed sword clutched in her trembling hands, her breath ragged, her mind unraveling at the seams. It whispered, always whispering, "You were stronger than them, greater than them. Take it all." And she had believed. She had raised the blade to the storm-ridden sky, and the world had answered. Now her army screamed, not in battle, not in defiance, but in horrific, mindless agony. The transformation. The first to change were her own warlocks, those closest to her, those who had chanted her name in devotion. Their skin blackened, bones cracking and reshaping, flesh twisting into grotesque new forms, their mouths stretched too wide, their fingers elongated into razor-like claws, their eyes vanished completely, leaving only hollow, pulsing voids. They did not cry for help, because they were no longer themselves. Across the battlefield, soldiers began to fall, their bodies contorting, breaking apart, reforming in ways that defied reason. Some grew extra limbs, their armor fusing to their flesh, turning them into lumbering abominations of steel and muscle. Others became insect-like, their skin hardening into chitinous exoskeletons, their blades replaced with writhing, venomous appendages. One witch elf, her devotion to Cain unshaken, even as her body warped beyond recognition, let out a scream of blissful ecstasy before ripping through her own sisters, her hunger no longer mortal. The storm raged, and Xelthara laughed, the horror unleashed. "She's lost control." Avra stumbled back, her ashen skin glowing faintly with divine power, but even Cain's favor could not shield her from the madness spreading across the field. She watched as her own warriors, her chosen brides of battle, turned into monstrous horrors, and still they fought, not for her, not for Cain, but for the hunger that had consumed them. She gritted her teeth. This was no longer a battle. This was annihilation. Vaydrith's escape. From the shadows, Vaydrith watched. He had seen madness before. He had seen sorcery turn men into monsters. But this was something else. His shades had already begun to retreat, slipping through the battlefield like ghosts, but not fast enough. One of his best assassins, Velkith the Pale, was caught in the storm's grasp, his skin sloughing off like melted wax, his flesh reforming into something that twitched and screamed, something that no longer knew what it had once been. Vaydrith did not wait to mourn. He ran, and as he did he whispered a single curse under his breath. "Damn you, Xelthara." Malzareth's last stand. He saw her, standing at the center of the storm, her body flickering between reality and something else, her eyes glowing with an unnatural hunger, her form no longer entirely Drukhi, no longer entirely mortal. The cursed blade was winning. It was feeding on her. And if she was not stopped, there would be nothing left of her or this battlefield. Malzeth tightened his grip on his sword. This was his war, and if he had to cut his own sister down, then so be it. He charged. The breaking point. As Malzareth closed the distance, Xelthar turned. She saw him. Her laughter died. For a moment, there was something human in her gaze. Then the blade spoke. "No, do not hesitate. He will take this from you. Kill him. Take his strength." She raised the sword, ready to strike him down, and her body shattered. The power she had stolen, the essence she had taken, the storm she had unleashed. It was too much. Her body could not contain it. The runes on her skin burned, her veins glowed white, her bones fractured under the weight of her own sorcery. She let out a piercing scream, not of rage, not of triumph, but of pure, mindless pain. And then she was gone. A burst of light and shadow erupted outward, throwing Malzareth back, sending shards of reality itself splintering through the battlefield. When the dust settled, when the storm began to fade, when the horrors still writhing in the mud realized their mistress was no longer there was nothing left of Xelthara but a smoking crater. Aftermath. The battlefield was ruined. The dead outnumbered the living. The monsters she had created still roamed the edges of the wasteland, mindless, leaderless, hunting anything that moved. Malzareth staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his cracked armor, his vision swimming. Vaedrith watched from a safe distance, eyes cold, mind already calculating his next move. Avery's. Her divine power flickering, turned to the battlefield with a horrified expression. Xelthara was gone, but what she had left behind was worse, and the war was not over. Not yet. Chapter 17. Cain's Price. The battlefield of Karond-Vael was already a graveyard. Xelthara's madness had turned warriors into abominations. The ground was soaked in sorcery and blood, and the few who remained breathed only out of defiance, not victory. But Averis saw only opportunity. The battlefield was not a ruin. It was an altar, and it was time to pay Cain's price. The ritual begins. Avery stood atop the shattered ruins of the great hall, her ashen skin glistening in the moonlight, her blade still slick with the blood of her enemies. Below her, the survivors of her war host knelt in silent reverence, their golden eyes hungry, devoted, lost to Cain's madness. The Hag Queens stood in a perfect circle, their robes soaked in ceremonial crimson, their faces expressionless as they whispered the words of an ancient prayer, one never meant to be spoken. The wind howled, carrying the stench of carnage and devotion, wrapping the battlefield in an unseen grip of divine hunger. Averis lifted her arms. Her fingernails were already stained black, her veins pulsing with the raw essence of Cain, her heart hammering not in fear, but in euphoria. "O Lord of murder, I offer you what is yours." She raised her dagger. The first throat was slit, then another, then another. A river of blood pooled at her feet, swirling, twisting, rising. The very earth trembled. The air thickened with heat, and the sky burned red. And then he came. The Avatar awakens. The blood at Avery's feet rose, defying gravity, twisting into something living. A form emerged, first a silhouette, then a towering mass of burning bronze and black steel. It had no face, only a horned helm of molten iron, its sockets hollow pits, filled with endless fire. Its hands gripped a great blade, a thing not crafted by mortal hands, but forged in slaughter, sharpened by suffering, fed with the death of kings. Avery fell to her knees, her breath stolen, her heart pounding against her ribs like a caged animal. She had prayed for a god, and Cain had answered. The Avatar of Cain had awakened. And it was hungry. The butchery begins. The screaming started immediately. The witch-elves threw themselves forward in frenzied ecstasy, their blades flashing, their war cries piercing the air, but they did not attack the enemy. They turned on each other. Cain did not differentiate between friend or foe. All were meat. The first witch-elf fell, her throat ripped open by her sister's blade, but she did not fight back. She laughed, even as her life drained away. More followed, cutting, slashing, their ritual turning into a holy slaughter. And then the avatar moved. It did not walk. It strode, an unstoppable monolith of divine rage, its blade singing with the wail of 1,000 souls. It cut through warriors like parchment. One of Malzareth's remaining knights raised his shield. The avatar's sword shattered it in a single blow, carving through steel, bone, and flesh in one brutal arc. Another warrior tried to flee. The avatar's burning gaze caught him, and in an instant, he was reduced to nothing but blackened ash. The battlefield became a cathedral of slaughter. Not a war, not a battle, a sacrifice. And Abras laughed, her lips parted in a rapturous smile, her body shaking with divine ecstasy. She had done it. She had become more than a warlord, more than a queen, more than a sorceress. She was Cain's chosen, and her siblings would burn in his name. Malzareth's defiance. Through the carnage, through the screams and fire, Malzara stood his ground. He had fought monsters before. He had fought daemons, hydras, warlocks, and horrors. But this was different. The thing before him was not a mere conjuration, not a mortal trick. It was a god's wrath given form. And yet he would not kneel. He raised his sword. His armor cracked, his body bleeding, his forces broken, but still he stood. Cain had come for his due, but Malzare had never been one to pay his debts. He churched the Avatar's judgment. The two titans met in the firestorm, Malzareth's blade clashing against the Avatar's molten steel. The impact shattered the ground beneath them, sending shockwaves rippling across the battlefield. But Malzareth was not a god. He was only a man, and a man cannot kill what does not bleed. The Avatar struck him down, its blade carving through armor, shattering bones, tearing through flesh. Malzare fell to one knee, coughing blood, his vision darkening, his strength failing. Above him, Avery stood upon the ruined altar, watching with rapturous delight. "You are strong, brother," she whispered. "But Cain is stronger." The Avatar raised its sword for the final blow. The end had come. Or so it seemed. The sky splits. Before the blade could fall, the air rippled. A shadow darker than night itself swept across the battlefield, swallowing the blood-red light of Cain's rage. The ritual was broken. Averis staggered back, her divine power flickering, failing, her connection to Khaine severed in an instant. He turned, eyes widening. Vaedrith stepped from the abyss, his daggers gleaming with unnatural shadow, his shades at his back, their weapons humming with death. And standing behind them, the one she had thought destroyed, Xelthar, or at least something that had once been Xelthar. Her body was no longer flesh, no longer fully mortal. The cursed blade in her hand pulsed, and the very air bent around her form, as though she was an after-image of something that should not exist. She smiled, and her whisper carried across the battlefield, soft as silk, cold as death. "Your God is nothing compared to what is coming." The battlefield fell silent. The war was not over. The true nightmare was only beginning. Chapter 18. The Duel of the Heirs. The throne room of Karond-Vael was drenched in blood. The war was over, but the killing was not. The great obsidian pillars that had once stood as monuments of power were cracked, their edges stained with gore. The once polished marble floors were slick with the remnants of those who had fallen. The banners of House Xelthar burned, tattered, or torn down entirely. This was no longer a palace. It was a graveyard, and at its heart 3 figures remained. The last heirs of House Xelthar. Malzareth. The warlord, battered and bleeding, but still standing, still defiant, his sword heavy in his grip. Vaedrith. The shade, blades at his side, his breath steady, his body poised like a serpent ready to strike. Avris, the murderess, her eyes burning with Cain's fading light, her robes soaked in crimson, her lips curved in a knowing smile. The air between them was thick with silence. The weight of all their betrayals, all their battles, all their hatred, pressing down like a heavy blade. It had always been leading to this, to one last fight. And only one would leave this room alive. Steel against shadows. Vaedrith moved first. A flicker of motion, a ghost in the dim torchlight, his blades flashing in twin arcs, aimed for Malzareth's throat. Malzareth blocked, steel meeting steel, the clash ringing through the ruined hall. The force of the impact sent him staggering back, but he was not outmatched. He had fought assassins before. He had fought Vaedrith before, and he knew how to win. A feint, left then right, Vaedrith struck high, then low, but Malzareth anticipated him, twisting his massive sword in a brutal arc, forcing the shade to retreat. Vaedrith hissed in frustration, darting to the side, his daggers seeking flesh once more. But this time, Malzareth did not dodge. He let the first dagger bite into his shoulder, felt the hot sting of steel carving flesh. And then he struck. His free hand clamped down on Vaedrith's wrist, twisting with bone-breaking force. The assassin's dagger fell from his grip, clattering to the floor. And Malzareth drove his sword through his brother's gut. Vaedrith choked, his breath escaping in a silent gasp, his body jerking violently as the blade impaled him. His dagger slipped from his other hand. His knees buckled. Malzareth stepped forward, pressing in closer, twisting the sword deeper. He leaned in, his voice a growl against his dying brother's ear. "You were always in the shadows, Vaedrith." His grip tightened. "And shadows fade." With a final shove, he pulled the blade free, and Vaedrith collapsed. His body hit the floor with a hollow thud, a black feather drifting from his cloak, landing beside him in a pool of his own blood. The great shade of the Blackspine Mountains was dead. But the fight was not over. The last strike. Avris was already moving. She did not mourn Vaedrith. She did not hesitate. Malzareth barely had time to turn before she was upon him, her dagger flashing forward, seeking his heart. He blocked, but she was faster. The first cut sliced across his ribs, the second found his exposed side, her blade carving deep into flesh, her smile widening as his blood coated her fingers. Malzareth grunted in pain, swinging his sword in a desperate counter, but she dodged effortlessly, dancing back with the grace of a predator. She was playing with him. She had always been playing with him. "You're slowing, brother," Avris murmured, licking the blood from her fingers. "Is the great warlord finally tiring?" Malzareth ground his teeth, refusing to fall, refusing to yield. But he felt it now. The wounds from the siege, the fight with Vaedrith, the exhaustion creeping into his bones like a death sentence. Avris saw it too, and she laughed. "Do you feel it, Malzareth?" she whispered. "The end?" She lunged again, her dagger aiming for his throat. And this time, he was too slow. The blade sank into his side, deep, too deep, piercing through muscle, through flesh, into something vital. Malzareth staggered, his vision blurring, his sword suddenly too heavy in his grip. His breath came in ragged gasps, blood pouring from his lips, his body failing him even as he tried to raise his blade one last time. Avery stepped back, watching, savoring the moment. "Kneel." Her voice was soft, almost gentle. "It's over." Malzareth glared at her, hatred burning in his fading gaze. But his legs buckled, and at last the warlord of Karond-Vael fell to his knees. Averis tilted her head, stepping closer, her dagger resting beneath his chin. She had waited for this. She had bled for this. And now only she remained. She leaned in, her lips close to his ear, savoring the taste of his defeat. "Goodbye, dear brother." Malzarat spat blood in her face. Her smile only widened, and she raised her blade for the final strike. The throne is hers. Or is it? The torches flickered. A shadow stirred, and before Averis could deliver the killing blow, something moved in the darkness behind her. Something that should not be there. Her eyes widened, her breath caught, and from the shadows of Karond-Vael, a voice whispered, "Did you think it would be that easy?" Averis whirled around, blade raised, and the figure stepped forward. A woman who should have been dead. A woman whose skin pulsed with unnatural energy, whose eyes gleamed with violet flame, whose blade hummed with whispers of something far worse than Cain himself. Xelthar had returned, and the war was not over. Not yet. Chapter 19. The ruin of House Xelthar. The throne room of Karond-Vael was silent. The fires of battle still burned beyond its shattered walls, but inside there was only stillness, the kind that follows a massacre, the kind that leaves only ghosts in its wake. Averis stood alone. Malzareth lay dead at her feet, his lifeblood pooling across the cold black stone, his once unyielding gaze now empty, lifeless. Vaedrith's body was already cold, his daggers still clutched in limp fingers, the assassin who had once lived in the shadows now swallowed by eternal darkness. And Xelthar? Gone. Not dead, but something else. Something worse. Averis felt the sting of victory as she wiped her blade clean, her hands steady, her breath measured. She had won. But then, why did it feel like she had lost everything? The realization settled upon her like a funeral shroud. There was no one left. She was the last Xelthar, and she was utterly alone. The Drachau Arrives. She heard the horns before she saw them. The sound echoed through the ruins, a cold, calculated note that promised nothing but judgment. Then came the black guard of Naggaroth. Their armored boots crushed the bones of the fallen as they marched through the shattered gates of Karond-Vael, their black halberds gleaming, their expressions hidden behind cold steel masks. And at their head, mounted atop a cold one draped in black ceremonial armor, rode Drachau, the Witch King's enforcer, the arbiter of Drachau law. Aivra stood defiant as he dismounted, her chin raised, her lips curling in the barest hint of a smirk. "You're late," she said. The Drachau did not react. He stepped forward, his golden eyes sweeping across the throne room, taking in the ruin of House Xelthar, the bodies of the last heirs, the blood-stained crown lying forgotten on the cold floor. Then, at last, he spoke. "House Xelthar is no more." The words cut deeper than any blade. Averis stiffened, her eyes narrowing. "This war was ours to fight," she said coldly, "and I stand victorious. Karond-Vael is mine. The armies are—" "Gone," the Drachau interrupted, his voice like a blade against ice. "You stand atop a ruin, Averis Xelthar. You rule nothing." The weight of his words settled upon her chest, suffocating, inescapable. "House Xelthar," he continued, his tone unfeeling, "has shamed itself before the Witch King. You were given power, and instead you waged war against yourselves like unruly beasts." Averis clenched her fists, blood dripping between her fingers. She wanted to argue, to fight, to kill him where he stood, but she couldn't. Because he was right. Her father had built a legacy of fear and strength, a house that had stood the test of centuries, that had carved its name into the annals of Naggaroth. And in the end, his children had torn it apart. Not Mal-Zurith, not Vaedrith, not Xelthar, all of them. And now, there was nothing left. The death of a dynasty. The Witch King has made his decree, the Drachau continued, stepping forward, his expression unreadable beneath his black helm. House Xelthar is dissolved, its titles are stripped, its lands are seized in the name of Naggaroth. Everis's breath caught in her throat. No, she whispered. The Drachau did not care. Karond-Vael will be claimed by the state. You may choose to kneel and serve, or you may die as the last remnant of a broken house. The blackguards stepped forward, their weapons raised, ready to strike at a single word. Averis stared at them, at the throne that was hers, at the empire she had bled for, at the empty hall where only ghosts remained. And for the first time she understood. She had won, and her victory meant nothing. She had spent her entire life fighting for power, only to realize too late that power meant nothing without something to rule. She had lost everything, and now she had two choices: kneel or die. The last Xelthar. The throne room was silent for a long time. Then Averis laughed. The sound was not bitter, not hollow. It was genuine. A sound of someone who had already lost everything, and yet still found amusement in the final cruelty of fate. She looked up, her golden eyes burning, her smirk returning even as blood dripped from her lips. She had fought too hard to die here. She had sacrificed too much to be buried beneath the ashes of her family's ruin. "Fine," she said, stepping forward, her movements slow, deliberate, unshaken. She dropped her blade onto the blood-stained floor, the clatter echoing like the last note of a funeral dirge. "I kneel." And she did. She lowered herself, the weight of the moment pressing down upon her shoulders like iron chains, her pride burning inside her like an open wound. But she was not broken. Not yet. The Drachau nodded, stepping past her toward the abandoned throne. "Then House Xelthar is no more," he said, his voice final. The blackguard turned, filing out of the ruined palace, their duty complete. Everis remained kneeling for a long moment, staring at the floor, at the blood-stained remnants of her house. And when she finally stood, she did so not as a noble, not as a queen, not as an heir, but as a survivor. House Xelthar was dead, but she was still alive. And in Naggaroth that was enough. For now. Chapter 20. The Last Heir. The night hung heavy over Karond-Vael. The fires of war had begun to die, but the smell of death remained, thick in the ruined corridors, seeping into the blackened stone of the fortress. Averis moved like a ghost, her cloak wrapped around her, her footfalls silent upon the blood-slick floor. She did not look back. Not at the throne she had lost. Not at the legacy she had shattered. Not at the family she had murdered. She had survived. That was all that mattered. She vanished into the shadows beyond the gates, into the vast, untamed wilderness of Naggaroth, where only the ruthless could endure. And the ruined throne room was left in silence. For a time, the shadow in the ruins. Then from the darkness something stirred. A faint, wet cough broke the silence, followed by the slow, painful scrape of metal against stone. A figure dragged itself forward, barely able to move, half broken, barely alive. Xelthar. She emerged from the rubble, her once elegant robes torn and bloodied, her body reduced to a wretched thing of scars, burns, and wounds that should have killed her. But she was not dead. She should have been erased, should have vanished with the storm she had unleashed, and yet something had held her together. Or rather, something had refused to let her go. In her trembling fingers, still pulsing with twisted, unnatural energy, was the cursed blade. Its runes still glowed with violet fire, its whispers still slithered through her mind, smooth as silk, cold as the grave. Meow. Fine, she had. It purred. You still have a role to play. Watching the future unfold. She staggered to her feet, barely able to hold herself upright, her breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. Her vision swam, her limbs shook, her body screamed for rest. But still, she turned her head toward the gates of Karond-Vael. She saw Avarice disappear into the night. She watched her sister flee, alone, broken, yet still clutching to life like a starving thing. And Xelthar smiled. It was a small, weak thing, barely noticeable, barely there at all. But it was real, because this was not the end. This was never meant to be the end. The others had fought for the throne, for the fortress, for titles and power, but Xelthara had glimpsed something beyond that. And she knew. She knew that Naggaroth was not finished with them. She knew that the cycle would never end. And she knew as she clutched the cursed blade to her chest, feeling its warmth, its promise, its endless, whispering hunger, that the true war had only just begun. Epilogue. The cycle continues. In Naggaroth there are no endings, only betrayals yet to come, only knives that have not yet found their mark, only rivals who still breathe, for now. The House of Xelthar was dead, but its heirs still lived, and as long as one still drew breath, the cycle of blood and vengeance would continue. One day Avarice would return. One day, Vaedrith's name would be spoken again in whispers. One day, Malzereth's death would be answered in steel. And one day, Xelthar would rise again. And when she did, she would watch the world burn.